Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Jean-Francois Gariepy. Hello, Jean-Francois. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on my show, Jean-Francois. So you wrote a brilliant book some time ago, The Revolutionary Phenotype. But before we begin to explore your thesis, Jean, you will be required to define some key terms. So what is a phenotype, what is a genotype, and what are memes?
Well, a genotype is simply our genes. So in our case, it's DNA. It's what is being transmitted when we make children. A phenotype is the rest of our body and the rest of everything we will cause in the world. It's the organism except the genotype. So it's everything in your body, everything you will ever do in your life, except your DNA. So DNA has the difference that it jumps from generation to generation through an actual process of copying, which is why our kids resemble us. Then you ask about memes. Memes is an idea that was laid out by Richard Dawkins, and it's the idea that IDs of human culture, they transmit themselves between human beings in the same way that genes do. And so it's the idea that human culture is subject to our theories of evolution as they apply to genes.
All right, so I wrote a piece once linking identity politics to memes, but I do know that in the scientific community, Richard Dawkins' position on memes, it was rebuked some time ago. What is the present consensus?
I think that memes have always had a hard time making it into a serious scientific idea. And in my book, I consider that I eliminate the idea for good. I don't think it's a good idea. I believe there's one problem with memes that leads them not to be subject to the theory of evolution, to the Darwinian selection process. And it's the problem, I mean, we can get into the details later, but essentially it's the problem that memes, unlike DNA, don't have their ways of modifying themselves, of mutating randomly. That is, when DNA changes, it's really an act of random. When your kids differ a little bit from you, because as we pass on our DNA to the next generation, about 60 letters of DNA over the 6 billion total that we have, 60 letters of DNA will be switched. They will change from one to the other, and it will be totally random. Now, as it turns out, that randomness is a needed process for selection to be Darwinian. If it's not random, if your evolution is in a predetermined direction, you're not evolving in a Darwinian fashion. And that has severe consequences, including the fact that you're not going to get into a direction of self-sustainability, self-care, and selfishness, as Richard Dawkins would term it. Now, the problem of memes is that as they copy themselves across brain, suppose I have an idea, I communicate it to you. The idea is not perfectly copied, and its mutations will be determined by your preferences. Suppose I was to copy an idea about, I don't know, identity politics, as you mentioned. You'll have your own interpretation of it. I have my own interpretation of it. The idea hasn't really copied itself. It has mutated. It may lead to totally different behaviors in you than it does in me. And for that reason, memes cannot be seen as a Darwinian replicator simply because they evolve and they change, not according to random, but according to preferences and how we approach them and what we want to drag from them.
I do agree with you, Jean, but the concept of memes, I do believe, can be utilized to explore identity politics. So, for example, you wrote a piece recently arguing that, in a sense, we're prone to like friendships and form new relationships, and cancel culture is a consequence of our desire to socialize in the broader group. So, for example, the issue of third party punishment, you may like John Brown as a writer, but John Brown made a politically incorrect statement, and as a result, he was cancelled. And in order to virtue signal, you joined them up to cancel John Brown. So mimetic selections are interesting to study broader political trends like identity politics. But as you said, the scientific data at this present point and further research have not they have not been supporting this idea.
Well, the theory you lay out is not a mimetic theory of the evolution of friendship or of emulation of behavior. It's very interesting what you lay out, and I think it's what's going on. Yes, people are evolutionarily incentivized to look like each other and to follow what each other think. But that is not mimetics. That is DNA having an advantage because it will put you in a better place in the workplace or perhaps in the sexual market to emulate others. That is not what mimetics says. Mimetics would have been that the memes themselves, the IDs, were evolving for the purpose of their own reproduction. That's not what I see. What I see is still people being caring for their own reproduction in the form of baby making.
Yes, I get your point broadly, but my paper was written for Mides, and Mides is an economic institution. But I'll send you the paper. It's quite short, and then we can discuss it via email. But I do believe that there is a role for mimetics in explaining cultural phenomena.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm willing to read your paper, but what I find is that there's very rarely a demonstration in people who claim that mimetics work, that memes have what it takes for Darwinian evolution to occur. And specifically, what I would be asking for is, can you prove that memes can mutate randomly? Because if they can't, then there's something non-random that determines their direction. And I'm afraid that non-randomness is the evolutionary interest of the DNA genes.
Mm. But Jean, you see, the problem with as you said earlier, mimetic is more cultural than scientific. When we talk about mimetics, we're not referring to actual genes. We're not even commenting on gene cultural co-evolutions. So I think we should just divorce mimetics from Darwinian evolution to create a new theory to explain cultural politics today.
Oh, well, if you want to do this, that's fine. But to me, it will never be the original meaning of mimetics. You can divorce it. And you know, I use the term meme sometimes out of accident and sometimes just because people have gotten used to the word. But we should never forget that this was an attempt at explaining human culture that failed by Richard Dawkins. Now, if we want the word to mean new things in the future, I'm all for it, because it certainly doesn't fit the original meaning anymore, and the original meaning is unsupportable anymore.
Yes, but it's still a fascinating era of research. And why I like this era of research is that in our present culture, studying politically contentious ideas is no longer supported. So maybe, Jean, the problem is that we are yet to identify that brilliant mind to really synthesize the meaning of mimetics. Yeah, maybe that's the problem.
It's a naive hope for the future. Yeah. I mean, like, it's like saying there will be a future theory and it will be great in physics. Okay, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah,
good luck.
Yeah, so for example, Anton Howes, he has several papers on the Industrial Revolution, and one of his key insights is that during the Industrial Revolution, innovators collaborated to different professions, but we live in an age that operates within silos. The polymath is no longer appreciated. And I think this is one reason why science is not as good as it should be based on the state of scientific research. So we have more access to scientific information than people like Newton and Darwin. But the studies that are being done, they're not flabbergasted. They're not blowing our minds. I'm really flabbergasted by them.
I fully agree. We have a very small culture that keeps aiming for the small.
Yeah, so like today we're shunning Richard Dawkins' theory of mimetics, but maybe we're doing it because we're not that smart. Yeah, maybe if we were Newton, Newton would have said, okay, this is where Richard went wrong.
No,
But
I mean, this is the goal of my book. My book aims to ask where did we go wrong, and ultimately, what is the right theory to talk of transition between life forms? Because what Richard Dawkins was seeing essentially is that in the human body, there would be two replicators. There would be intention. There were the genes, our DNA, and then the memes, our IDs. What went wrong in this? And I think I found it, which is that a replicator like memes, if it wants to see itself become a true Darwinian replicator, must have certain other features that human culture still doesn't have. So that's what I call the revolutionary phenotype. It would be something that would address the mimetics problem properly, rather than the way Richard Dawkins went.
all right, and so we're going to talk more deeply about your book now. What is the main essence of your book, The Revolutionary Phenotype?
So the essence of my book is that I went on a thought experiment, and I wanted to convince myself that the ideas of Richard Dawkins were absolutely solid. And I was convinced of this, and I wanted to test them to the extreme. Because Richard Dawkins came out with the selfish gene and essentially provided a theory, a new synthesis of the theory of evolution that is replicator-centric evolution, gene-centric evolution, that leads you to see the gene as the center unit of the natural selection process. And to me, since my childhood, that has been a stunning revelation, how powerful the selfish gene is to explain everything we see alive today. And I was trusting this idea so much that I wanted to put it to the most extreme test, which is, what if I try to violate the selfish gene? What if I try to stop evolution? And this is what I've done. And what I found out is that it's not artificial. It's not just something that may happen in the future of humanity, that we will stop our evolution. It's something that has already happened. And that, in fact, it is what's happening at the transition between different life forms. And that 4 billion years ago, there was an event of a phenotypic revolution, which is an event during which the evolution of a replicator stops. And it's completely reverted by some product that has occurred. So a phenotypic revolution is whenever a life form ends up creating another life form, and that other life form ends up taking over the genetic system that the ancient life form used to have. Now, in our case, if we were to do what has been done 4 billion years ago on this planet, what it would look like is essentially we would start producing computers. Computers would start determining our genes, perhaps because parents would be interested at modifying the genes in future children. They would eventually trust the computer more and more to determine more and more of the constitution of their children, until eventually the computers would completely take over the genetic constitution of humanity and turn humans into sterile workers of a kind of queen colony system like we see in ants and bees. This is what we're headed for, I find in my book. If we ever start trusting computers or ever start trusting anything else to determine our genes must remain randomly evolving. If we don't go for random evolution, what we will have is central control that will probably be given to an AI or something of that sort. Now, this is very futuristic, but the scary thing is that every ingredient for it to happen are available on Earth right now. You don't need a future super machine or super AI. All you need is a little computer that makes statistical inferences about how happy people are with one gene or another. And we already have all of the tools in CRISPR to modify ourselves genetically. What my book finds is that it's been 4 billion years that no life form on Earth has ever played with its own genes. But that 4 billion years ago, when DNA appeared, this marked a moment in history where life forms started playing with their own genes. And ultimately, the life form that has preceded us was not DNA-based like us. It was an RNA life form. It existed in a simple form, probably on planet Earth. It may have come from some other stars or other star systems, but eventually came on planet Earth, or it was just born on planet Earth. But in any case, it started engaging in modifications of its own genes. And that's what led to the creation of DNA. If we ever engage in a phenotypic revolution again, we will have another genetic layer, which will probably be constituted by bits on a hard drive of a computer. And that's not looking good for our creativity, for our intelligence, and for everything that we tend to define as being human. We will lose all of it if we become the sterile worker of a central control system.
Jean, the light bulbs in my head, they're going off. Central control. So based on what I've been hearing from you, innovation will decline. So I'm fond of spontaneous order and the relationship between economic freedom and innovation. And what you're saying to us is that we do not need the singularity to have this revolution. It can occur without the singularity.
Exactly. The singularity is a red herring. It really doesn't matter how intelligent computers become. The computers have already the level of advance technologically to control our genes because they can do statistics. A computer like the Google platform with all of its computers in California or whatever, they could easily process the ensemble of all genes on Earth with 23andMe, for example. In fact, people are voluntarily giving their genes to 23andMe. They could easily see how people are faring well in income, intelligence, other markers of well-being, and they could provide recommendations for future parents to modify their future babies. And computers of today can very well do this. The idea of a singularity and of computers becoming extremely intelligent doesn't matter to our evolution, because no matter how intelligent they are, we'll be able to listen to them or not listen to them. But the minute we give the control of our children's gene to a computer, that's the moment at which we don't have a choice anymore. We can't choose away from the AI. We will be controlled by it because we will be determined by it. And by this time, the AI will be able to make us into a submissive life form. What I'm proposing is exactly what's happening in insect colonies. One thing you see in insect colonies is the sterile workers, they are subordinated, they are slaves to the interest of the hive or the mold of sand for ants, and they will serve the queen. And the minute a central computer determines our genes, that's also how we will become. We won't be able to reproduce anymore, and we will eventually just serve the function of the queen, which will be the computer determining all of us.
So Jean-Francois, in a world controlled by central planning determined by AI, Silicon Valley could never be a feature because innovation is a trial and error process.
Well, Silicon Valley couldn't be born again, but Silicon Valley would probably be the central controller of such a future. So that's a sad thing, that things that are born with in the beauty of a free systems like Silicon Valley, it was born because there was some degree of liberty and internet was a wild, wild west, and it led to a lot of innovation. But what we see in the last few years is actually that Silicon Valley is very much willing to be a transitionary platform toward essentially fascism and control. We've seen them censor people. We've seen them determine the truth and call everything else misinformation. They will do the same eventually with genetic modifications. And it seems that it's not because you are the product of liberty that you will be supporting liberty forever. In fact, Google has given up one of its principles, which was don't be evil. And so we're headed toward probably a very evil future for these entities that, yes, were born out of freedom.
Jean, so I want to ask you another question. During your explanation, I'm sure that you said that we're no longer evolving. I heard something to that effect. Could you expound a little bit more on the issue?
Uh, I'm losing the connection. If you can repeat the question.
Okay, I will repeat the question. During your explanation, you said that we are no longer evolving. Expound a little bit more on this issue, please.
Well, I don't think I said this because we are still
Oh,
evolving.
that's what you said. We're
So
still
you must
evolving.
have
Okay. Yeah,
yeah, we're still evolving. People think that we're not evolving because the people think that you can only evolve when people die in the jungle, surviving, combating nature. But that's not true. The fact is, we still evolve because as long as there's people not making the same amount of babies, we evolve in a certain direction. Now, our direction may not be very appealing. It may be dysgenic to some extent. You could say, well, maybe 100 years ago, someone was evolving to be creative or to be planning ahead, to be capable of caring for pigs, cows, chicken. And someone today may be evolving to be dependent on social welfare and perhaps evolving toward conformism in terms of the leftist mentality and in terms of displaying your morals. But we're still evolving in a direction, even if it's a sad direction.
it is a sad direction, and unfortunately, rising IQ scores may not avert the coming calamity because, as you say, computers do not need to be highly intelligent to unleash this new revolution.
Absolutely. And so I'm not a big fan of increasing IQ. However, we do have to have some care about maintaining a certain degree of intellectual capacity in the population. But I think that we are reaching the peak of the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect has been the improvement of intelligence measures for the last 100 years or so. I think we're arriving at the peak and that we may be past the peak, in fact, in the sense that we may not be able to get further improvement. And this may relate to a lot of things, perhaps certain genetic evolutionary pressures making us dumber, perhaps also the reaching the ceiling of what public school can do, and also perhaps mechanisms of corruption and lack of selection in the public schooling system, and ultimately the corruption of academia that results from its constant funding by state entities.
Edward Dutton and other researchers are even observing a Flynn effect for the developing world. And some time ago, Michael Woodley of Meany did a paper titled Are the Victorians Smarter? But my issue, Jean Paul, is not that the Flynn effect is being reversed, but the concern that the smart fraction is not as smart as it once was in the past. That's my concern. Because economic
Well,
growth
it's a,
is, let me continue. Economic growth is really dependent on the smart fraction, the highly intelligent people who change society with their products and ideas. And based on what I've been observing, the smart fraction is either not as smart as it was in the past, or maybe due to political correctness, these people are unable to express groundbreaking ideas. But my concern is really the quality of the smart fraction, and the smart fraction is complemented by intellectual autonomy and individualism, two robust predictors of economic growth and innovation.
I agree. I think it's a very decent thing to be worried about. Our intelligentsia is failing at advancing in some major way through scientific breakthrough, and so they are merely carrying small science at this point. And yes, it's a worry. There are other worries, though. The general lack of intelligence in the population, and if we go even further down, might lead to problems like violence, social disorganization. But ultimately, yes, there is a failure at the higher scale, at the intelligentsia level. I think that our intelligentsia ultimately always failed at creating a world in which intelligence or creativity would be maintainable. And so we've discovered a couple of things that's fascinating in the advances of science, but never have we made a proper science of human biological management. The way we do very well when we look at birds and squirrels, an evolutionary biologist will immediately understand that you shouldn't feed, for example, birds in a park because you will create an evolutionary pressure that makes them less capable, less intelligent, because they become dependent on humans. But we haven't had the same enlightenment in the management of human societies, and that's a problem.
Yes, so for example, Bruce Charlton in his papers argued that there is selection against the genius type, in the sense that modern societies prefer people who are conscientious and high in rule following, but innovators are eccentric. They're basically weirdos. And this is,
Yeah,
you may go ahead.
definitely there is a big pressure against weirdos. I know because I'm one, and I keep being faced with women who, instead of caring about my actual scientific achievements, will care about uh, things that are social in nature, or the things like how do I look at them, or how do I behave in that or this situation. So because of sexual selection, there is an incapacity for the other sex, the other side of the sexual dichotomy, to properly be aligned to the actual intellectual prowess. And so because of this, we select away from the intellectual prowess.
Yeah, so let me give another perfect example. YouTube. What is the purpose of YouTube? YouTube is a platform to entertain. It is not the Wall Street Journal or the Economist. If you take YouTube seriously, you're basically an ass. You shouldn't be getting your news from YouTube. But due to the rise of political correctness, managers, IT people, whatever you wish to call them at YouTube, are wasting time trying to avert the consequences of political incorrectness when they should be improving the user experience. So this is a cost. It's a cost that's imposed on consumers and on YouTubers.
Absolutely. And it's a dictatorship of the unintelligent. There was a time where YouTube was free. And personally, I take YouTube much more seriously than you seem to say there. Personally, I think that YouTube is a platform where certain debates cannot happen possibly in other contexts, but they should be happening on YouTube. And we've made them happen in 2016, 2017, when I was hosting Bloodsport debates. But it got banned by YouTube, and it got repressed. And so we find ourselves with the tool that has been created in human civilizational history, the only tool that was ever available for free debate to occur and for an actual process of the search for truth to happen, which couldn't happen on cable TV, couldn't happen in the halls of academia, and yet they destroyed it because they couldn't hear it.
Exactly my point. And so far my channel on YouTube has been doing well because it's a small channel, over 900 subscribers, and because I'm showing my face, it's evident that I'm black. And in cancel culture is more likely to victimize white people, so I guess my complexion insulates me from being canceled. But people are surprised. One person said, "You interviewed Jim Gold. How did YouTube not ban that interview?" Ricardo Duchenne is actually canceled. Ricardo Duchenne told me that he was canceled from all platforms, but I interviewed him and I posted it to YouTube, and it has over 1,000 views. So I guess YouTube works if you're white. But back to more serious issues, Jean, are you interested in what some term mutational load? The argument is that mutational load has increased since the advent of industrialization. Michael Woodley of Mean and Ed Dutton, they make this argument, and Ed Dutton has addressed it in a full-length book, and his co-authors are Matthew Saroff and Colin Feltham. Yeah, so you can go.
Yeah, I don't like this idea because, yeah, well, I know about it. I'm familiar with it, and I don't like it because I think it's a misrepresentation of what's happening in civilization. It's not mutational load if it's being selected for. So the current dysgeny of our civilization is driving a selection force for certain genes that you may judge as being genes that make you incapable and unintelligent, but from the perspective of the genes, these genes are being successful. They are being rewarded for unintelligence. So I wouldn't call it mutational load. I would simply call it a selection pressure that you perceive personally as dysgenic. And I'm talking to Edward Dutton, to Michael Woodley here. I don't think it's very clever and intelligent to be labeling these things mutational load when they are not being just loaded as random mutations that make dysgeny. They are essentially being selected for, and therefore are part of the evolutionary process, just like the genes that make birds fly. We wouldn't call it a mutational load that led to handicapped limbs. No, we would call them wings, and we would say, okay, those wings allow to fly, and therefore the birds are evolving. Humans are evolving also, and we may be evolving toward less intelligence and toward more ugly features of the phenotype, but that's still evolution. It's still selection going on.
All right, so Jean, I'm a bit of an eccentric writer and researcher myself, and if you are a mainstream academic, you're going to think that my ideas are dubious. But Jean, is economics driving evolution? And let me explain. Addison Ray is a young woman. She has millions of followers, I believe, on TikTok. I don't pay attention to Addison Ray because, as I said to you via the message on Twitter, I don't like social media. But Addison Ray has done well. She's responding to the market, not a problem. Then we have something called OnlyFans. There are people with PhDs who are now working on OnlyFans, selling their bodies. Again, market value in the marketplace is subjective, but personally, I prefer IT, manufacturing, retail, real sector. So this is my question. People are turned to OnlyFans and TikTok because of economic crisis. Some persons may be wealthy, and TikTok provides a platform for them to make more money. But many of these people, I'm assuming, are average in terms of intelligence. So economic crises have created a situation where industries we originally viewed as unproductive or unimportant are now driving growth in some sectors. So, on a long-term basis, are economic crises selecting for negative traits or unintelligent traits we consider to be frivolous or flippant? So I don't care for OnlyFans or TikTok. This is what I have to say in a nutshell. I know it sounds a bit convoluted, but give me your opinion. Yeah.
Well, I think that economic crisis will have evolutionary effects, but I don't see them as negative as you seem to present them. I think that, in fact, it's probably in times of good economy that the most parasitism develops in society, because the good businesses, they have so much surplus that they pay taxes, and because they pay taxes, there will be more and more bureaucrats essentially being evolutionarily rewarded for occupying a parasitic position in society. So I think it's the other way around. If anything, surplus and good economy runs will lead to more parasitism, more unintelligence developing. And on the other hand, an economic crisis is a break or pass kind of test. It's ultimately you can see what humans are about when the times are more dire, and when you see females ultimately return to their traditional role, which is to display boobs and on OnlyFans, that is a return to nature.
Yeah, so Jean, you're so eclectic. To those who are uninformed and unread, well, the alt-right is a misnomer, a meaningless term. But to those who are unread, you sound like a conservative. But based on what you have been conveying, it appears that you're on the classical liberal side of the spectrum. Philosophically, I'm a libertarian, but in my personal life, I'm really conservative. And I do agree with your take on economic crisis. Maybe only fans and TikTok represent an evolution in economic creativity, but I'm too boring to recognize it. Yes, maybe that's the issue.
Maybe.
And
Now, classical liberal is not a label I would endorse. I'm a libertarian, and to me, classical liberalism is a form of desire to return to the 70s state of Western civilization, and to me, that's not far enough behind. I'm a traditionalist, and I believe we should return to a very, very small state of less than 3% of the economy. We should return in the state we were in the 19th century in America.
yes, the Gladstonian revolution. And I must say this, Jean, Hans Hermann Hoppe elucidated novel arguments for the monarchy, and Hans Hermann Hoppe was actually inspired by this brilliant but unknown philosopher called Eric von Leden. Most people are unfamiliar with Eric von Leden, but contrary to what some assume, there is actually a surplus of studies highlighting the benefits of Anne's perspective. Monarchies, when compared to democracies, are better off. And the most recent study was done by African researchers, and they argue that the relationship between monarchy and economic growth is not significant, but it is slightly higher than the relationship between democracies and economic growth. So Anne isn't that weird after all.
Yes, I agree with Hans Hermann Hoppe's criticism of democracy. The problem of the monarchy is that it's an openly parasitic system, but that is at times self-contained. And so it can perform better than the democracy. The problem of the democracy that it is at no time self-contained, unless we would have better constitutions that keep us protected from this. Democracies tend to grow toward absolute parasitism of the entire society.
And they're actually driven by envy, but we're going to discuss this at a later point. But the medieval ages, I read several books and articles on the medieval ages. They were not perfect, like our present time is imperfect. But again, contrary to what some believe, there was a greater degree of freedom in the medieval ages when compared to some metrics in modern societies. Some academics have described our own state as de-civilization. Medieval barons and noblemen had to respect the rights of serfs and the people who they employed. They would agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like the idea of a difference between liberty on paper and effective liberty, because America definitely, if you look at the U.S., you have rights in the U.S. that I don't in Canada, like the First Amendment principles, the Second Amendment. But when you look into effective liberty in Canada, if you live away from big centers, big towns, you can effectively have a greater amount of liberty than you would in the US. So it's interesting to see the difference between the pragmatic, effective liberty and what's on paper.
And we should revisit authors like Fritz Kern, who provided us with a treasure trove of knowledge on life in the medieval ages. As I said earlier, they were not perfect, but there was respect for human dignity, the human as a being. Today, contractual rights benefit corporations. And we say this without hesitation.
Yes, and there's always been also in these times, no matter how much of your liberties could be abridged, the liberty of the family was always respected. And our modern society is stepping over a very dangerous boundary in attacking the family unit and attacking heterosexual reproduction. It's a dangerous path to take, and it's a non-evolutionary one. And unfortunately, I'm afraid this will lead to a reply to a revolution.
These arguments were enunciated by Stephen Baskerville, who was recently on the show. And in one of his articles written some years ago for the National Humanities Institute, he gave an example of a judge who basically said, "We don't care about the rights of fathers. The state has a vested interest in subverting the authority of the family and of fathers. The family is the most individualistic unit in society. Our personalities are cultivated and shaped by the family. So the moment you defenestrate the family and the church, you basically have a robot."
Exactly. And that's a problem. I don't think it's possible for a society to maintain itself in that state because we have abandoned the signal between the father and the children. We have deprived certain father of any contact with their children. And for others, we have just forced them into public school. Many countries in Western Europe, public school has been given as the only choice. In fact, it's illegal to homeschool. It's increasingly being attacked in America through child protective services and other services of that kind. So yes, we are headed toward a complete divorce between the father, the mother, and the children.
Yeah, so well, Jean, I don't want to sound pretentious, but I'm a serious guy. And when I read foolish stories like Harvard professor knocks homeschool, I don't even bother to remember the name of the professor. But one professor from Harvard was actually bashing homeschooling. Now, why would you bash homeschooling? That's a private foray. It's not your business if people choose to homeschool their children. There's
Yeah, her
no.
name is Elizabeth Bartolet. She's the Harvard Law School professor who organized the conference against homeschooling. And it's a very dangerous path to take for academia to be starting to be subversively penetrating the family with with essentially an ideology that seeks to destroy it and to destroy the descendants, the lines of descent that must survive for civilization itself to survive.
And another issue we must address into on the topic of homeschooling, Jean Paul, is that there is no right to education. Education is a commodity that must be bought and paid for, and historically only a select few went to school. And Gregory Clark has a new paper out arguing that the gains of investing in the lower class are not great, and this is something that we do know. I don't have a problem if working class people up to attend university or high school, but the truth is that such people are better served as entrepreneurs or tradespeople. And there is a thrust to encourage mass-based education, and it will end badly.
Absolutely. We're giving diplomas to people that don't mean anything anymore because there's not even a selection effect. We want everyone to have a university diploma. And the reality is, we don't need that much university production. And what we need are more plumbers and things that are basic. And and there's this fake vision that, oh, the university diploma will guarantee you a salary, when in fact it doesn't. We end up with so many people unable to find job in their sectors that they've studied for. So I think we should stop deceiving people. What we are in front of is a fictitious skewed economy created by governmental programs that favor the development of these educational programs that are useless, and it's being maintained through the anti-bankruptcy rules that are applied to student loans, the student loans themselves, the lowering of the fees by governmental contributions and grants. All of it is an artificial economy. The fact is, whether it's a Duke education, a Harvard education, or even those smaller universities, it's not worth what people are paying for. It's not worth $500,000. It's not worth $100,000. It's barely worth $5,000. And people are paying much more than they should because ultimately there is fake demand.
Yes, and another issue is that PhD graduates are not what they were in the 50s and 60s. One study actually argues that the verbal IQ of graduates is not impressive anymore.
Yes, and I'm seeing it myself in terms of even my book, for example. I have difficulty finding young biologists who are just intelligent enough to even care about theoretical advancement in evolutionary theory. I used to be at a very high level university, so I did my postdoc at Duke. I was surrounded by extremely high IQ people. But if you get outside of these tight circles, even in the academia, you will find certain labs, certain places where people are simply unintelligent.
Yes, the study was done by Jean Tweng, W. Key Campbell, and Ryan A. Sherman, titled Decline in Vocabulary Among American Adults Within Levels of Educational Attainment, 1974 to 2016. Highlights: when controlled for educational attainment, adults' vocabulary skills have declined. The vocabulary of US college graduates was lower in the 2010s versus the late 1970s. Vocabulary declined across all levels of educational attainment. The decline in vocabulary is primarily a time period effect. Sad.
And I think this reveals a hidden truth about education. It's that education is not just the idea of teaching stuff to people and they get better. Education used to be a selective force of society. And it wasn't so much what you were learning by sitting in class and listening to the teacher, although it was part of this. It was that universities were selecting their base, and therefore they were selecting what would come out at the end. And as selection goes down, and as universities want to be more and more inclusive, we end up with a given diploma being worthless and leading to student products that are much lower standard, precisely because they weren't selected in the first place.
And John, we must dispel the notion that jobs are getting harder to acquire. This is not the issue. The issue is, as you rightly said, colleges are not selecting for the best and the brightest. People who are intelligent are gifted in their ability to extrapolate. They can apply knowledge. So for example, Peter Thiel is a brilliant mathematician, but he studied philosophy. And I've read stories of people with degrees in philosophy who work in finance. The issue is that our students today, they have specific cognitive skills, but in terms of G, they're not quite bright. So the typical philosophy graduate today cannot work as a marketing manager. He's not even able to see the link between philosophy and management consulting.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the problem.
There's a lack of you named polymath capabilities.
Yeah, that's the problem. So I studied history and international relations. After graduating, I got a job, got an interview, turned down interviews, and people who studied actuarial science were searching for jobs. They're intelligent, but in terms of G, they're not that bright. So if you give them a paper and say, study Newton's theorems, they're going to do excellent. But if you ask them, what is the relationship between actuarial science and cybersecurity? They cannot fashion a proper sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a big problem. And such people, they begrudge Addison Rae, because Addison Rae is this random girl. I don't know her IQ, but she's doing well on TikTok. And this Paul Musgrave, he wrote the articles for Foreign Policy, and they're laughing. Yes, people were complaining that they went to elite schools to study journalism, yet Addison Rae is basically acting like a journalist. Well, Addison Rae may be higher in terms of G, and she's creative. You have a PhD in sociology or journalism, but you're an idiot.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, you're an idiot. So for example, I have a friend, she has an MBA, she's off the charts brilliant, and for a woman, oh my god, she is so cold. And I said to her, people are wondering, how is it possible that a random person from a developing country who contributes to American publications that are not mainstream, how is he interviewing people like yourself and Charles Murray? And she would look at me and she would say, well, I am not surprised. You have a brain and you know what you're doing, and don't give away your secret. Yeah, that's the problem. G is declining and people are just silly. You have a PhD in philosophy and you're not doing anything with philosophy. We live in an age where people love to talk about gratitude. Write some book on gratitude. People are suckers for gratitude. Yeah, and it baffles me. Instead of wasting time lamenting that Alison Ray is so rich on Twitter, get a job.
Yes, do
Yeah,
stuff.
yes, and there's actually evidence for the argument that envy drives public policy. Timothy Bates recently published a paper. Envy drives debate in democratic societies. People, so for example, in Switzerland some years ago, well, the Swiss are smart people, so they did not vote to cap the salaries of highly paid professionals. But in another given context, people may choose to go that route, even though it's deleterious. If you cap the salary of a CEO, will he be motivated to perform? No. And the truth is that there's a clear correlation between CEO performance and pay, despite what some believe.
Yes, and I really don't like this leftist attitude of turning envy into a Marxist combat between class, because the fact is, the bigger a corporation like McDonald's or Walmart is, it really doesn't affect me as long as there's no state to uh, to to make corruption possible for these agents. If we were in a free economy, they can become as big as they want. It won't change my life because they won't be able to interfere with my liberties. And if I don't want to give them my business, I will go elsewhere. The leftists, they take issue with the accumulation of wealth, and that's an exploitative direction that they're taking, where they just want to drain the wealth of anyone who's built it. But by doing so, they are punishing the building of wealth, and they're also not realizing the right path for them, which is emulate those who have built wealth rather than combat them.
And Jean, I love data. I love consuming data. And for all those unread leftists, Schumpeterian innovation is still evident. The study was done by Ryan Bourne of the Cato Institute. So yes, monopolies do exist, but they often die.
Yeah, because a monopoly anyway is stuck with the problem that they cannot expand. And so the only way they can really expand is by spreading to new fields and spending money. And they would have to get rid of some of their wealth to try to take risk into the future. And so the trend for monopolies is to dilute themselves back into society.
Yes, and the free market cannot create a monopoly. Monopolies are often enriched by government subsidies. You can read Ayn Rand, Dwight Lee, and many other scholars. And again, I'm always annoyed because leftists, they make these sweeping generalization when the evidence is staring them right in the face. And as someone
Absolutely.
who's only driven by data, I cannot appreciate this mix. But Jean, Michael Behe, Stephen, David Gill, Stephen Meyer, and others have been criticizing Darwinian evolution. I don't know if you have been reading their articles, but do you take the objections of critics of Darwinian evolution seriously?
No, I mean I'm familiar with these critiques,
Good.
and they
So
are not
you can talk.
serious.
So let's start with Stephen Meyer since you're familiar with him. Okay. What are your objections to Stephen?
Well, his claim, if I represent it well, I believe is that the proteins of the human body or any modern life form are so complex that the mathematical possibilities that one could find this sequence of amino acid, for example, the ribosome, are astronomically high and impossible to reach in a given amount of time on planet Earth. And so you would conclude that it's impossible that the ribosome has been put together by random, and that there must have been a force involved that is not random. And to that, my answer is, well, evolution is not random to begin with. Evolution is not a throw of the die. Evolution does not try to cycle through every possibility and find the current ribosome. The current ribosome is what it is because of an evolutionary process in which there were intermediary ribosomes before. And ultimately, we reach the level of complexity of current proteins from much simpler templates that existed in the past. And if you allow that evolution is progressive, and that yes, the mutations are random, but that the selection is not random, the selection makes it so that that generation after generation, the things that work are favored. And so the path to the current ribosome appears absolutely reachable within the degrees of known mutation rates on planet Earth. You don't need to invoke random because evolution is not random.
All right. And what do you think about scientists? These people are not religious. They're scientists, but they espouse intelligent design. What are the flaws inherent in their arguments?
Well, of course, I don't subscribe to intelligent design, and the simple reason is with the Occam razor, you do not invoke explanations that are not needed for the current state of observation. So if we were to observe that some people came on Earth and produced life as we know it, and that it's not evolution that led to it, but it was a bunch of gods or extraterrestrials just shaping us into who we are, I would then believe that theory. But there's no evidence of this. In fact, all the evidence seems to point to a process of natural selection, which happened without supervision, which happened simply out of the evolutionary interest that different species had in their niche.
And Jean-Francois, what about the Cambrian explosion? Is this disputing Darwinian evolution, as some would contend?
No, it is not. People look at this Cambrian explosion, which is essentially a part of the fossil record where we find a bigger diversity of body plans. Essentially, you know, all of the animals almost today on Earth, those that you see and know about, they are bilateral animals. We have a ventral side and a dorsal side. That's a bilateral organization. The Cambrian explosion corresponds to a moment in the evolution of life, which was hundreds of millions of years ago, in which there were many body plans, very different ways of organizing the organism. And to that I say, and people are like, this is such an explosion. It is a reflection that an evolutionary process that is progressive cannot be invoked. To that I answer, the Cambrian explosion could be an artifact. It may not even be true. It may be an artifact of the fact that the conditions back then on Earth were hotter, probably, and were allowing suddenly the creation of bigger and bigger organisms. And what we call the Cambrian explosion may simply be the fact that we have more fossils from this time period than we do for previous time periods, simply because the animals tended to become much bigger in this particular time, and therefore were fossilizing much better. That's the artifactual theory of the Cambrian explosion. But even if the artifactual theory is not true, just the fact that there's a bunch of different branches explored by life and explored by animals doesn't mean that the evolutionary process is not at play. In fact, it is not a necessary condition of Darwinian evolution that things be progressive. Darwinian evolution can go extremely quick, and it can generate different solutions extremely quick. It's all a matter of how much mutation you have and how much selection strength is there on it. If there are serious environmental changes, or if there are new mutational spaces that weren't available before or become available now, you will get the generation of lots of diversity. There's nothing that keeps from it, and therefore it's not a good argument against evolution, the fact that there's this Cambrian explosion.
All right. So, Jean-Francois, on this show, sometimes I may raise objection to the assertions of my guests, but I'm no longer doing that. People like it when the interviewer just shuts up. Yeah.
It's all good.
Yeah, people like it when the interviewer shuts up, and I guess I've already built a base as a writer and an interviewer who in the past we talk a lot. But Jean, we're wrapping up, and you are a funny guy. This is a serious show. People often give me a lot of upvotes, but name this. We're going to briefly explain a topic that's important to you. So mention something that's crazy but important to you.
Oh well, I think that my biggest mission on Earth is to combat the revolutionary phenotype, and so it's a little crazy. But what we have to do is to politically stop the genetic modification of babies on planet Earth, and we must stop it across the whole planet. We must make sure that not a single person does it.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is probably my craziest idea.
And what's your position on women?
My position on women, well, interactions with women are extremely hard and costly and energy demanding. So women will at times become abusive, lie about you, and attempt to destroy your life in every possible way. But they are a needed bottleneck to future generations. And so we must find a way to live together. And probably it passes through an understanding that their condition is due to a different evolutionary history than us men, and that evolutionary history led them to have to test the solidity of their males by throwing all sorts of things at them, including lies and pain and all sorts of things. And so if you want to play the game of reproduction, you have to accept this and
Yes.
accept that it's a game.
The Manipulated Man, written by Esther Villar. Usually it is men who are manipulated by women. And the Me Too movement, for many reasons, should not be taken seriously. Emmanuel Macron is married to his teacher. They met when he was a student. Had she been a man, we would have seen her as a perpetrator, a sexual murderer. Had
Yes,
she been a man.
absolutely.
So I
There is a
cannot.
double standard in
Yes.
this perception of the violent male or the predator, as they call them often.
Yes. But it was a pleasure to speak to you, Jean Paul, but unfortunately I have to wrap up. All
All
good
right, no
things must
problem.
come to
Thanks
an
for
end.
having me.
All right then, bye.
Bye bye.
All right.